dynamics of the US-Egypt relationship, which is being hosted in partnership with AmCham Egypt Inc. Before we get underway, I wanted to provide a quick overview of the Council and share some context for today's program. As one of the oldest and most historic bilateral business councils housed at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the U.S.-Egypt Business Council was founded in 1979, just a day after the historic Camp David peace accords, and has been viewed by both the United States and Egypt as the strategic home to the bilateral commercial relationship. The Council was launched in the presence of President Sadat and President Carter at the U.S. Chamber's headquarters right across from the White House, and is comprised of roughly 50 American companies across every sector of industry that does business in Egypt. The Council is chaired by the Apache Corporation, the largest U.S. investor in Egypt. We are also glad to have a very positive working relationship with both the US government and the government of Egypt. And in the interest of this audience, the Council has hosted President Sisi for high-level meetings at least 7 times in Washington, New York, and Cairo, and most recently in a virtual setting last April. Turning to today's discussion, it is no surprise that the economic relationship is one of the key pillars of the strategic relationship between the US and Egypt. Of course, another is the security and defense relationship. And here I want to note that this aspect is not only important to the overall relationship, but it is vitally important to US business interest in the entire Middle East and North Africa region. There's an old saying that the region in many ways has historically looked to Egypt as for a leadership role in terms of both influencing and leading the Arab world. It has been a long-standing partner of the United States. Our speakers will speak to the security and political relationships, but on the commercial side, American companies have succeeded in Egypt, and particularly over the last 5 years, the business environment continues to improve. So Egypt in many ways is a pillar of our commercial relationship in the Middle East. For this reason, we are excited today to explore the intersection between these two key pillars and hear insights from 2 leading experts in the field. Simon Ledeen is founder of Perimus Consulting and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. Dr. Marwa Maizad is a non-resident scholar, defense and security program expert at the Middle East Institute and faculty fellow at History and Center for Israel Studies at the American University. Ahead of hearing from our guests, I will first turn to our friend and partner, CEO of AmCham Egypt Inc., Hisham Fahmy, for some brief welcome remarks before I turn things over to Caslin Kennedy, Vice President for Corporate Communications and Public Affairs at Apache Corporation, to introduce our distinguished guest experts. Hisham, over to you.
Thank you, Kush. As a recap, also AmCham Egypt Inc. is the mirror organization of AmCham Egypt, which was started in 1984. We have become the largest AmCham in the Middle East, and we work very closely with the U.S. Chamber and the U.S. Egypt Business Council. We represent about 2,000 executives in Egypt and in the United States. And it's a real pleasure to have you here. Just before I start, I'd like to welcome our newly elected president, Tariq Tawfiq, who's on the line. Hi, Tariq. Thanks for joining.
Hi, how are you?
It's a pleasure having you both, Simon and Marwa, here. This is a very opportune moment in the U.S.-Egypt relations, especially as it pertains to the mill-to-mill relationship in particular. And you guys are the expertise, so we're going to look forward to hearing a lot about that. A lot is going on in the region. That Egypt is very much at the forefront. If you look at Libya, if you look at Gaza, Sudan, Ethiopia, and so on, Egypt's military has been diversifying in the last few years, and maybe we can hear a bit about that from you. Also, on the economic front, the Egyptian military is divesting some of its own companies. At the same time, having partnerships with multinational companies and the private sector in Egypt. So there's a lot going on, and as Kush said, be brief. So I am being brief. I'll turn it to you, Catherine.
Thank you so much. My name is Kathleen Kennedy. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs for Apache Corporation. As Kush mentioned, we are one of the largest U.S. investors in Egypt and have over 2 decades of experience in the country. Egypt is, in fact, one of the key operating areas for Apache and a key part of Apache's future. So we greatly appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I have the honor of introducing our speakers. So first, I'm going to start with Simone. Simone Ledeen is a strategic influencer of complex long-term initiatives and plans with global impact. Through her work, she has helped shape the thinking of the nation's senior-most leaders, including members of Congress, U.S. government officials, and partners abroad on matters of defense, finance, telecom, and transportation. She served in various U.S. government and business leadership positions, most recently as the presidentially appointed Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Middle East Policy, where her leadership of U.S. defense policy spanned Bahrain, Egypt, Israel, Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Oman, Palestinian Authority, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Syria, UAE, and Yemen. Her experience on multiple overseas deployments influenced key counterterrorism activities, intelligence collection and analysis, as well as military information support operations involving cyber and disinformation, irregular warfare, direct action, sensitive special ops, and personnel recovery and hostage issues. Prior to her appointment with the Department of Defense, she served as executive director at Standard Chartered Bank, managing multinational financial crime compliance, a senior U.S. Treasury representative to NATO's International Security Assistance Force, advisor to the Iraqi Ministry of Finance, and as a member of the Coalition Provisional Authority. She currently serves as a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute and visiting fellow at the National Security Institute of George Mason University's Scalia School of Law, where she advocates to foster global security and facilitate international business. Thank you so much for being with us, Simone. We're also joined today by Dr. Marwa Mazied. She is a non-resident scholar with Middle East Institute's Defense and Security Program, a scholar at the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies, and a former visiting assistant professor at Seattle University. She is also a senior fellow at American University's Center for Israeli Studies in Washington, D.C. She specializes in civil-military relations. She's an Egyptian American with 20 years of experience teaching and lecturing internationally in higher education institutions in the United States, Europe, and the Middle East. She is a published author in peer-reviewed academic journals that cover international relations, global security, U.S. foreign and defense policies, and civil-military relations. Her current book project builds on her research at the University of Washington, where she earned her PhD, titled Middle East Militaries, In and Out of Politics and Economies Due to External Threat Perceptions, a dynamic regional order approach to civil-military relations, comparative cases of Turkey, Egypt, and Israel. During the COVID-19 pandemic, she temporarily acted as a senior advisor to the Egyptian Center for Strategic Studies and advised on Egypt's coronavirus policies, particularly the early and timely decision to establish a lockdown by mid-March. So with that, I'll turn it over to Simone first for some opening comments.
Thanks, Kathleen, and thanks to AmCham Egypt for the opportunity to speak with you today about Egypt, along with my friend Dr. Marwa Mazied. I appreciate her insight so much, and I know that you will too. We also are really looking forward to plenty of time for discussion, so I'd like to keep my remarks brief. In a series of articles I recently published after leaving government, I argued that the United States should support President Sisi and his government in order to contain the Muslim Brotherhood both inside and outside its borders. Egypt's short-lived Muslim Brotherhood-led government was ideologically driven and an unmitigated disaster for both governance and the Egyptian people. The Brotherhood was founded on its members' desire to establish an Islamic state and governed under Sharia law. This political movement was and is against American interests. The last thing the US and indeed Egypt's neighbors in the region need is a totalitarian Islamist state in Egypt. Moreover, a Muslim Brotherhood dictatorship extending its reach outside Egypt's borders would pose a significant risk to regional stability, including US and Western interests, and would not result in desired improvements to Egyptian human rights practices. Egypt plays a critical role, not only in the Muslim world, but as an important US ally in the region. In addition, Egypt is a core ally of Israel. Thankfully, Egypt has been at peace with Israel for over 40 years. It is in the US interest to provide support to ensure this remains the case. However, it is not difficult to contemplate that a country governed by totalitarian Islamic extremists may not take the same approach in its relations with the Jewish state. The new US administration should therefore continue to build a stronger Egypt where human rights abuses are both rare and addressed by pushing back against the potential for any new regime where the Egyptian people have diminished freedoms and security. As many of you are aware, when Egypt's military ousted the democratically elected Muslim Brotherhood leader Mohamed Morsi in 2013, the Obama administration suspended a significant portion of military sales, pending what they called progress toward an inclusive, democratically elected civilian government through free and fair elections. At perhaps the most tumultuous point in modern Arab history, Cairo felt abandoned by the United States. The Egyptian government faced internal unrest and Islamist violence. Extremists were on the rise in Sinai, on its western border with Libya, and throughout the region as states fell like dominoes. Egypt thus looked to satisfy its defense requirements elsewhere. Since then, Congress continues to place regular human rights holds on military aid, including the withholding of $300 million in security assistance each year until the Secretary of State certifies that Egypt is taking various steps towards supporting democracy. The Secretary of State can instead sign a national security waiver and has done so during both the Obama and Trump administrations. The result of these regular holds has not been a more democratic Egypt, but rather continued significant degradation of America's credibility as a strategic partner, diminished influence with Cairo, and a boon to competitors happy to fill the gap. To be more specific, between 2000 and 2009, sales from the United States accounted for 75% of Egypt's total arms imports. During the subsequent decade, only 23% of Egypt's total arms imports have been of US origin, with the rise in non-US arms purchases skyrocketing just after 2013. Given its location between Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean, with a population of over 100 million on Europe's southern flank, Egypt is a key theater for today's great power competition. Cairo controls the Suez Canal, the strategic maritime choke point connecting the Mediterranean and Red Seas as the shortest shipping route between Europe and Asia. In addition to its commercial significance, overflight and quick turn access through the Suez are critical for ongoing US military operations across CENTCOM. Amid rising threats from Iran in 2019, for example, the Egyptian Navy expedited transit through the Suez of the USS Abraham Lincoln and its associated bombers to the region. Egypt's central location also means it faces a myriad of threats on multiple fronts, which, if not contained, will not only destabilize the country, but would likely further exacerbate profound regional tensions. Libya's persistent civil war continues on Egypt's western border. An increasingly kinetic ISIS insurgency in North Sinai rages along the Israeli border. Water scarcity is exacerbated by construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia. Turkish adventurism rises around the Mediterranean, and Iran-backed Houthis menace the Red Sea, not to mention the threat of violent Islamist groups within Egypt's mainland. Egypt is increasingly concerned about the Sinai, as it is losing control of the Sinai Bedouin and their land east of the Suez. One method Egypt is employing for managing this challenge is expanding development projects in the Sinai in order to resettle a large number of Egyptians to the area. On June 10th, the Northern Sinai Governorate announced that the state had spent 4 billion Egyptian pounds, about $255 million, since 2014 on projects there. Hopefully, more economic opportunity will reduce the motivation of those who are currently attracted to extremist violence. Let's shift and talk about Turkey for a moment. While Egypt remains concerned about all the regional threats that we have discussed, the Sisi government is deeply concerned about Turkey, particularly its support for the Muslim Brotherhood, as well as Islamist fighters paid by Turkey and transported to fight in Libya. But there are reasons for the resumption of an official diplomatic dialogue between Cairo and Ankara, not just Libya, but also the need to achieve greater stability in the Eastern Mediterranean region. I hope they keep talking. While the 2019 Turkish-Libyan Defense Agreement accepts a lasting Turkish military presence in Libya, that is unacceptable to the Egyptian government. Cairo has not retreated from its position that both Turkish forces and Turkish-sponsored Syrian mercenaries should leave the country. Egypt fears that Ankara's military patronage of Tripoli, combined with the long-lasting Turkish support for the Muslim Brotherhood, could create an Islamic-oriented government in Tripoli. This could be considered an existential threat for President Sisi and his anti-Islamist government in the long term. President Sisi's Egypt had been largely ignored by the Biden administration due to congressional Democrats prioritizing human rights above any other considerations. Recent actions by President Sisi have upended this narrative by injecting Egypt into the current Israeli-Palestinian discussion, where Egypt has historically played an important role and where he helped broker peace, at least for now, in Gaza between Israel and Hamas. Many did not see that coming. Those of us who have been arguing that the Egypt relationship is vital are pleased to see the new narrative emerge and are hopeful that the coming years will serve to further strengthen the deep ties between the US and Egypt. That concludes my remarks. Over to you, Marwa.
Okay, well, thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to converse with you today. I might just start with stating a few points, and then we can open up for discussion. I will second everything that Simone said, so I will not repeat some of that, but I'm just going to say that I acknowledge all of this. I agree with all these threats that surround Egypt that I would love to engage with later. So to start with, Egypt is an important Middle East country and a reliable US partner. So Egypt is located within its region. It stands on its own. It's very influential and important within its region. And the fact that it's a reliable US partner, that brings us together, the United States and Egypt. It has one of the 20th strongest militaries in the world. And in comparison to regional powers such as Turkey and Israel, Egypt is actually ranked 12th, while Turkey is ranked 10th and Israel is ranked 14th strongest army in the world. So these three powers are, they keep an eye on each other. They are also, all of them are strong US partners, Turkey, Egypt, and Israel. but there is a regional dynamic that keeps these countries in need of having strong defense, no offense and no expansionism, but very strong defense in order to be on par with one another. Turkey, on the other hand, has been actually exhibiting some of this pan-Islamist expansionism in the region, and that's why there was the kind of political turmoil that Simone mentioned over the past 8 years, really. Turkey being perceived by Egypt as forming an alliance with Qatar that is promoting some pan-Islamism in the region. You see it in Tunisia, in Gaza, in Syria, in Libya. There was a vision somehow for the region, and that became the main fault line, against which Egypt, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain formed a counterbalance to this kind of expansionism. And interestingly, Egypt, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain had converged upon interests with Israel most recently. So this became the main fault line. I know many people mention Iran as the most important threat to the region, threat to our US interests, threat to Israel. But interestingly, during these past 8 years, Turkey, Qatar, the Sunni version of panism, also became as much of a threat and was attended to. And I think Egypt was at the forefront of highlighting that and standing up to that and forming sub-alliances within in order to keep that at bay. Egypt actually managed through this policy to keep that kind of pan-Islamism at bay in Libya. So the western border of Egypt was secured after a lot of infiltration and problems. Gaza also, all these transnational terrorism that goes back and forth through tunnels into the Sinai and recruit local Egyptians, but under a very transnational umbrella. It's not just a domestic insurgency within Sinai or such. It has its transnational connections and economic and financial support and ties. So Egypt, having dealt with this very eminent threat within its region, it shifted to a little bit more ease and stability within that. So this policy was applied for the past 8 years with the transition of different governments in the United States. So we reach a point now that some see that the militant political Islamism has subsided, as if that is already the new reality. That Egypt also is forming new understandings with Turkey, being as expansionist as it is, but kind of being kept at bay. So there is normalization talks, for instance. We can talk about that. With Qatar, and there was this kind of reconciliation, but a reconciliation with an understanding that each country already marked its territory. So, as I say, some see that the militant political Islamism has subsided, but many see, and I would agree with that, that this is a recurring threat, that it has been activated since 1928 and the founding of the Muslim Brotherhood. It comes and goes over decades because the Islamist doctrine of activating mercenary jihadists anywhere in the world is based on ideologies and interpretations of the concept of war in Islam. So every time someone can delve into that, someone and some entities, some governments, some alliances would delve into that, even as the way Western powers supported freedom fighters in Afghanistan in the 80s. Every time we get into this, that can be reactivated. So it's an ongoing threat, even if it subsides. So that's on the geopolitical level. I would say that Egypt stood up to these regional hegemonic projects emanating from Turkey and Qatar and succeeded at keeping this Islamist force at bay in these regions, I said. So much so that actually Egypt even positively contributed to the change in the Sudan, another neighbor that is very involved in also the Horn of Africa politics, and the Islamist regime that was there was replaced by a new government that even made normalization deals with Israel. So you can see that Egypt steadily addressed the threats around it and successfully maneuvered enough to use its influence without threatening anybody, really, to change these dynamics. Egypt established new relations with important players like France. Egypt sees eye to eye with the French policies in the region, as well as French policies towards transnational Islamism that is attacking the French Republic itself. Very strong ties with President Macron. Egypt agrees with Greece on East Mediterranean energy and security affairs. With Germany, it signed arms deals. And when it comes to great power competition, with Russia and China also, I mean, a topic of interest to the United States, Egypt created its own relations with Russia and with China semi-independently, but in a way that rendered every player in the region having to respond to the Russian presence and the Chinese presence as well. For instance, Egypt collaborated with China on data sharing early on vis-a-vis the COVID-19, and I think that informed Egypt's policies towards COVID. And in fact, Egyptian growth, economic growth in Egypt increased more than any other country during this one period, and that primarily has to do with mega construction projects that are addressing big cities, including the new administrative capital, and the role of the state and the military in the economy, which is very debated. It's controversial, but in certain situations, like even post-World War II in the United States, the role of the state in the U.S. government in motivating economic development through construction is actually a template that Egypt followed. So many people sometimes think that Egypt looks at Soviet-style models, but actually Egypt is very influenced by the United States in terms of the very military role in the economies, and we can discuss that more. Given that that was the topic of my research. So to conclude, I would say Egypt is stable, it's here to stay. It will outlast many, if not all, of the regional threats directly aimed at its secularizing status defensive position. And it will, I would say, bets are to be replaced on Egypt. And in terms of human rights, because this is a topic for the US administration, especially the current one, there is a detail there. President Sisi always talks about the idea of linking human rights to both political rights, representing freedom of expression, free association, organizing, peaceful succession of power, etc., political rights. But also he keeps saying, let's look at economic rights, the higher standard of living, improved quality of life, all these economic indicators that someone as very active as the civilian Minister of Investment, Rani al-Mashad, works on these issues and wants to raise these standards of living for Egyptians. So as he points the United States to think of economic rights when discussing human rights, I would say the United States should engage with this outlook respectfully and acknowledge that indeed economic rights are as important as political rights, all while acknowledging and deepening the practical discussion of the semi-far future post-Sisi's government, like what is to come after that, and discuss that with the acknowledgement that he is here for a while, especially that Erdogan is there for 17 years himself, reaching 23 years, just as much as Tunisian Ben Ali himself. So Sisi and Erdogan are going to be here at the same time. So nobody should expect Sisi to go before Erdogan, let's say. So as we are discussing political future of Egypt, an acknowledgement of the economic successes would make the conversation better and more sincere, really. So we can speak in detail about change in the Obama to Trump to Biden administrations vis-a-vis Egypt. We can focus on Syria, Libya, Gaza, and Israel, or the East Mediterranean, or the Horn of Africa with the Renaissance Dam. And we can discuss more about the great power competition. So these some are topics that I would be happy to address later. So with that, I'll just end here and say that the U.S.-Egypt relations are strong. They are here to stay with various administrations because it's a strategic partnership and a choice that Egypt made really since Sadat. So, yeah, with that, we can open it for the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Simone, and thank you, Marwa. Let me kind of start the discussion with the first question, if I may, to both of you. We'll start with Simone and then Marwa. Love your perspective as well. You're both right, and absolutely that Egypt has been a long-standing friend and partner of the US, and a reliable one with all of the changes in the region. That said, it is particularly as the Biden administration took office, there was a feeling that Egypt was given a cold shoulder. The only lens that Washington started to look at Egypt was the human rights lens. Subsequent to that, Egypt proved that it was a long-standing and reliable friend and partner in helping Sisi himself getting involved to bring a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. And President Sisi and President Biden had 2 calls, apparently at least, that we know took place. The question, therefore, is, now that help from Egypt has been obtained, again, is the state, is your view that State Department, the USG, is moved on, again, taking Egypt kind of for granted, or just is your view, or related to that, what should the USG, particularly on non-defense, but state, commerce, and others, be doing from your perspectives?
So thanks for the question. Great question. I think it's clear that the Biden administration at the outset had pushed aside the Egypt relationship for the reason that you mentioned. I also think, and I say that because there was no call. There was no call between President Biden and President Sisi that's been made public. The first call was after President Sisi and his government helped to negotiate a ceasefire. So it's very clear that that those actions that the Egyptians took during that time were viewed by the Biden administration as profound and important enough to relook at the relationship, reprioritize certain things, which based on my personal philosophy and what I outlined at the outset, I think is great, and it's hopefully not too late. It's just the beginning of the administration where perhaps they had a certain view that was proven wrong. So I personally am optimistic because of the economic development focus. So not only is Egypt focused on development in the Sinai, which I want to be optimistic and say that will help to keep violence levels low, because people will have economic opportunity and they'll be too busy working to want to blow things up. I hope that, I think all people of the world, most people of the world would like to see peace for the Palestinians and the Israelis. And, the hope is that economic opportunity and economic development will help that to to transpire. The big challenge, and you're talking to someone who has a pretty extensive background in the area of financial crime. The big challenge is, especially when you're talking about a Hamas-controlled Gaza, is how do you get the funds to where they need to go, and how do you make sure they're not diverted? This is a conversation that's happening here in Washington, and I assume in Cairo as well. It's not easy when the Israeli government has been directing Qatar to make payments directly to Hamas over the past X number of years in order to try to quiet the violence. We could have a separate debate about, has that been effective, or has that been actually encouraging more violence whenever they need more money, just to send up some more incendiary balloons. But that's not the conversation we're having today. But no, I think it cannot be overstated the overwhelmingly positive outlook, I think, that is facing Egypt in the United States right now, given what they just accomplished. And I think it's wonderful to see. It's really a 180 from where they started with the Biden administration. And I hope and believe that it will just further strengthen the relationship, and everyone is coming to see, if they have not already, that this partnership between our two nations is vitally important for a broader regional peace.
Marwa, would you like to also comment on the question in terms of potential for follow-up actions by the U.S. to, continue the positive engagement that took place post Egypt's intervention to resolve the conflict?
I think the first in the region to have congratulated President Biden was actually President Sisi, while all the other partners, Turkish, Israeli partners, my focus are on these two, kind of postponed that until we know what's up with Trump and all of that. So Egypt, Sisi was clever to do that early on, to say that our relationship as the United States with Egypt is a valued partnership, no matter who is elected in the United States. So that was the message, and I think it didn't have an immediate response from the Biden. It's not like they gave him any bonus points, but when it adds up like that, by the time the Gaza issue flared up, Egypt again acted well to say, I'm the reliable partner. I know how to broker these ceasefires for the past 20 years anyway, speaking with the Palestinians, including Hamas, by the way. Egypt, of course, has security envoys and ties that deal with Hamas, not on the diplomatic level, but on the security level. And it brokered these ceasefires back in 2014, when Turkey and Qatar actually were trying to be the main players and brokers here, and they failed. And Israel preferred Egypt, probably because it had some suspicions about what Turkey and Qatar might actually accomplish and get into by having this direct tie with Gaza as well. So it wanted to moderate that. So Egypt does play a role in the region, and it renewed that. So once that happened, I think the administration, the Biden administration, wanted to be very exact about commending that, thanking that, being grateful for that. And then even when Blinken was asked directly about human rights and will you pressure on that, he wanted to emphasize that this is a value for the administration. He cannot change the U.S. values and this administration emphasis, but he also understands, and I think that's what I addressed in my comments, exactly that. I think there could be a way of doing that, which is if two partners are speaking about, I'm emphasizing this, look at that, praise me for that too, because I'm working on this, at least do that, and then they would be more listening actually and more receptive to other issues. And I do see that the even political, also mind you, the political prisoners, that Sisi denies that there aren't any political prisoners. They are just criminals. But those political prisoners have to do mostly with Muslim Brotherhood, Islamist ideology, etc., etc. So if we actually reach some arrangement and understanding regarding that and regarding the countries that support that, which is Turkey and Qatar and all this media rhetoric over there, the financing over there, once the states, actually the countries, sort out the relationships, you'll find that these issues solve themselves one way or another. So I would say there is progress in that. There is some understanding on how to tackle that.
Thank you. Hisham, you have a question.
Yes, thank you, Kush. Thank you both. Our talking points. I want to ask about something that is so important to Egypt and even the Egyptian people. You both didn't touch on the Ethiopian dam and the GERD and what's going there and what should Egypt be doing and what should the US be doing. It's something that it's really the existential threat at the moment.
Thank you for your question. I have to say that I am not an expert in this specific area, and I don't want to embarrass myself by trying to address this. So I'm going to punt it over to Marwa.
So actually, my forthcoming chapter is on Horn of Africa politics out of Manchester University Press. So I just spent some time editing that, but it took over, academic publications take a year. So things develop over a year since you start writing something and by the time it's supposed to be published. But I've been following this file actually quite closely and in comparative fashion. Dams are an issue, Turkey, for instance, is another case where all these dams and barrages and all sorts of constructions Turkey had over the past 17 years under Erdogan reached 1,500 constructions on the Tigris and Euphrates. And that there are studies and papers written on how that affected Iraq and Syria, so much so that some attribute the climate change, that the crops that were failing around 2010 in Syria had to do with some of this water scarcity over it's an environmental water issue that hit the country, and then with the crops failing, it was an incident, and all of that even started rallying and happening against Bashar. So there was some explanation even back then to these issues. So 10 years later, you see how much the impact of these dams can have on countries, on politics, on economics, and all sorts of things. Now, specifically to Egypt, would it reach this point where it becomes like Iraq or Syria and threatened by drought and crops failing after something happens with the dam? This is really up for debates, and experts are really thinking about that. But I would say, from the political standpoint, we have to be very cognizant of this and very much following up on that, so that even if the problem also is not just, as I say, one dam that generates electricity and Ethiopia has its power and Egypt, the water reaches Egypt anyway, and it's all good. The problem might be that actually we learn after the fact that this is one of a series of other 4 or 5 dams that Ethiopia plans to put ahead. So this is starting to sound and behave like the Turkey behavior against Iraq and Syria. I would say that Egypt has been cognizant of that. I don't think it's oblivious. Many people think that it came as a surprise. It isn't. Mind you that it's been 10 years since Ethiopia mentioned that it wants to have the dam, and we have gained technically 10 years of transition of not having reached that point of a dam that cuts water from Egypt or anything. Nothing happened for 10 years. These 10 years were good 10 years for Egypt to actually also adjust some of its water policies, to recognize that having 100 million people Either way, 55 billion square cubic meters, whatever the unit, will not be sufficient for 100 million people anyway. When these treaties were written, Egypt was barely 10 million people, so that the dose, or like the quantity of water per capita, all of that was very good for that, but it's not good anyway if you have that number of people. So Egypt had to work on desalination anyway, like any desert country, like Saudi Arabia next door, for instance. It had to work on other modes of watering crops and instead of.
Marwa, can I ask you a question though? Sorry to interrupt. What do you think, the technical details aside, what do you think that the U.S. role could or should be in this matter? Because I know there's a lot of debate, and the U.S. so far hasn't come out with any statement whatsoever.
I think the U.S. has not been has not had a negative impact anyway. I mean, it has been neutral somewhat towards that, but not so neutral. Under Trump, for instance, it backed Egypt enough. You know, it gave a signal that Egypt has a right there and it's doing the right thing. So I think being like that is all what Egypt for now needs anyway, to have the recognition that what Egypt is doing so far has been the right thing, including signing the treaty in 2015 to show goodwill about the prosperity of a neighboring country and all of that. So I think Egypt and the United States so far are managing the situation well. Now, down the road, if in fact the dam starts to represent the kind of problems that Iraq and Syria were subjected to, rest assured, Egypt will not allow that to happen, like it didn't allow any of these situations with transnational terrorism to happen to it in the shape of Iraq and Syria anyway. And there would be wars down that road, but that's really far from now. If that happens, I think the United States will support any act of existential threat towards a U.S. partner like Egypt. But I think we're so far from that even happening that I'm not as concerned as I think Egypt and the United States are both handling that relationship vis-a-vis that file so far quite well. And I see Hisham is shaking his head. He's not convinced. So maybe that's too optimistic, but I would love to hear.
I really think you're very, very optimistic. I think, I mean, and the last 10 years have been negotiated. There have been agreements on the dam with Egypt and other countries. My issue is that don't underestimate the threat that's going to happen with the second filling, and that's coming very soon. And I think something is going to happen soon, which is something I don't want. I'll stop here. I don't want.
Sure.
I'll just say that I don't disagree with this. That's why I started by saying how terrible the effect of these dams in Turkey were on Iraq and Syria. So I'm acknowledging 100% that even 10 years ago and 20 years ago. But I'm saying that maybe there are tools in Egypt, diplomatic and otherwise, and military, and the United States, that they will tackle and deal with this in a way that is not as with having these adverse consequences as in Syria and Iraq. I would just say that, and we should look more into what these could look like, but so that we don't reach that outcome, because definitely the outcome can be here, but we can also have agency and change that outcome if we continue to think together on this.
Thank you. We have our next question, I believe, from Ibrahim Fahmy. Ibrahim?
No relation.
No.
No relation. Hello, good morning and good evening for everyone. My name is Ibrahim Fahmy with Mirasco. I have, thank you so much for the guests, Ms. Ledina and Ms. Dr. Maziad. I have a question regarding the fighting the radical Islamization in Egypt and in the region, I mean, in general. Basically, the increase of the radical concepts of Islam is mostly because of lack of education. I mean, the 30 years during President Mubarak really was no modernization for our education system in Egypt at all. So what is the US doing to help Egypt to modernize the education policy and the teacher training, and enhancing their economic standards of teachers, so this way they can build a new generation that are modern and positive thinking and do not count on radical religious ideology to to get away from poverty and their bad economic standards. And the same applied to the rest of the region as well, in Gaza and Sinai. So what would be the policies to better build up new generations, and what can the US do to do that? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I'm not sure my answer to you will be completely satisfying, other than that I agree with you. I do think education, modern education is incredibly important, and will counteract some of these ideas that are not congruous with the kind of open modern world that we all wish to live in. I do think that there are programs available, but through the United States, I don't know if this is the best way, to be honest with you. Does Egypt want to rely on the United States for educating its own population? Certainly there are programs that the US has through USAID and other government agencies that would support this, but I do think a lot of these questions are shared by many Arab countries and countries throughout the Arab and Muslim world, not just the Arab countries actually, but across the Muslim world. And I think there are many differences among these countries, and so it can be it's a delicate conversation, but perhaps this is something that the U.S. shouldn't really be a leader on, and nor does Egypt really need U.S. leadership for this type of activity. I would argue, whereas the U.S. is sort of changing its focus and has changed its focus already to great power competition. The resources that the U.S. will continue to, the U.S. government, I should clarify, will continue to pump into the Middle East. I mean, the volume and amount of money in general that the U.S. government is putting into the Middle East has changed quite dramatically and quite quickly. So in terms of prioritizing what does Egypt want from the U.S., where does education rank on that scale? And again, that's why I say perhaps there's another answer to your question that doesn't really involve the United States leading on this particular issue.
I think it's a great question. And now, once you asked it, actually, I started thinking, I get all these notifications from U.S. Embassy and all the programs and USAID and all of that. And I really now think that this really impacts people who get involved and get educated to different ways of doing things. And then they come back to Egypt and they do things. So the entrepreneurial spirit or women or I did watch, there was some programs about women educators in particular, like teachers, to have some training and come back. So I think that does have an impact, because any cultural exchange and opening with a different culture, namely a Western culture, or even in that respect, if they go to China or Russia, even with the great power countries, even our adversaries, if they go do training in diverse cultures, that will have a positive impact on Egyptians in the sense of not being exclusively Arab Muslim, and that's it. If we're talking about just diverse peoples of the world and being open and culturally open, that will be beneficial. So whoever is doing an exchange with Egypt and partnering with Egypt, being Europe, the United States, or other countries, is good. There are Japanese schools here in Egypt, for instance. There is this and that. I think the more Egyptians start thinking of themselves as at the crossroad of all these cultures, East and West and South and North, and open their mind, and of course that comes from policies within Egypt that invites them to do that, then they will have license to do that. Once there was like 40 years or decades of encouraging Islamism as, okay, you go to the mosque or go to you watch TV or whatever, and that was okay, but sanctioned by the state as allowing it to be the discourse, you found generations that are speaking in this rhetoric and this discourse. Once that is, I'm not even saying just replaced, but there are other venues, then people at the societal level will be able to pick and choose different vocabulary and outlooks and such. So again, yes, I agree with Simone. It's not like the US is going to fix Egypt's education and cultural directions, but it's already playing a role. The Fulbright, all of these things do have an impact when people go and come back. And also other countries having this partnership with Egypt will dilute this sense of very insular, egocentric vision of what a Muslim is or what an Arab is.
We are nearing our allocated time, so I'd like to pose a final question to both of you. What would you like to see the US government do now in terms of a gesture and action that can help continue the momentum from the Biden-Sisi initial engagement? And I say that because the US-Egypt Business Council would take that seriously in terms of our recommendations to the US government. Simone, let me start off with you, and then Marwa will give you the last word.
Well, I would have two recommendations. Number one, I think a really important signal would be to have an official state visit of President Sisi here to Washington, D.C. I think that would be the strongest signal. I think another very strong signal would be, if they don't want to do something that public, would be a clear message to the Congress and to the Democrat leadership in Congress to discontinue with these holds because they have affected the relationship very deleteriously, and also Egypt's national security, I might say, as well. So, those are sort of the two main recommendations that I have.
Noted, very much so. Dr. Marwa?
Simone even has more experience in that, so I totally agree with this. So the signaling of the state visit and also to Congress, maybe signaling to the businesses also that Egypt is open for business, and that's there is a narrative that it is a reliable partner and that we can invest there because we're there and we're here to stay as Americans in this partnership. So instead of the very conflicting messages that comes and goes, and according to lobbying somewhat positively and then counter, like all of that, what happened since Sisi came to power, really, we would bypass that and state that Egypt as the country, regarding of the administration and how long it will last for all these geopolitical reasons, we are placing our bets on this partnership, and therefore people would come and do business, and also all these programs continue to work instead of, I remember, for instance, there was a moment where Fulbright closed down its office, or were laying off people, or there was a sense of like, we don't know if we're even going to be here for that, like signaling that that is not the direction we're getting into anymore. We bypass that would be very helpful.
Well, thank you. Before we close, just want to check if anyone else, Caslin or anyone else, have any other questions for Simone or Marwa. Hisham, go ahead.
I have a question. May I ask it?
Yeah, of course.
I want to turn your question around. What do you think the Egyptian government should be, or the Egyptian private sector should be doing to convince the U.S. government and Congress on all the points that you have mentioned, and how to do it?
Well, I think if you take the fact that this negotiated ceasefire has brought so much goodness with it, make sure that it continues. So what is required in order to make this more of a long-term success? And what are the destabilizing factors that need to be addressed in Gaza? There are many. There are many, but those are what need to get tackled. That's what needs to get tackled. And I think an Egyptian government that seriously addresses those things will be in turn continue to be taken seriously. I think in terms of business relationships, I want to commend all of you in terms of what you have done and what you have built over these decades. It truly is a testament to the relationship and all of the common goals that we have in terms of the world that we all would like to live in. You're really making that a reality, and you have over several decades. And so congratulations to you. I really do believe it's a model that people should talk about more, and there should be more publicity about all of the very strong economic ties. I know on the defense side, we've recently started the state sponsor program. So we have like the Texas National Guard and the Egyptian Army. That's a great relationship that really should be. I've been glad to see a lot of publicity on that, and I think that should continue because there's a lot of personal exchange and personal relationships that are built up that way. And over the years, people that start out at a low level in these relationships can later on in life become leaders, government leaders, industry leaders. And those relationships continue, and you never know what kind of fruit that will bear later on. So all of these things are incredibly important. Obviously, I don't know how much President Biden plans to travel during these next years, but certainly, an official invitation for him to come visit, or the Secretary of State, or I think all of those would be important, those sorts of invitations. And I would hope certainly that the administration would accept at a sufficiently senior level. So thank you. Again, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure to speak with you all today.
Thank you, Simone. Marwa, closing thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, really. When I thought about what can the Egyptian government do, I think what can the Egyptian government, also individuals as well, I think one attitude, maybe a change in attitude would have to be that the Egyptians should claim their presence in the relationship. I think often of Israeli-U.S. relations and how Israeli government and Israeli business and Israeli institutions partner up with the United States, delving into that relationship without some of the trepidations and sensitivities that I often feel Egyptians might have about having a partnership with the United States, as if there's something that has to be a little vague or secretive about stating that the U.S. has a strategic partnership with Egypt. So I think some of that might have to change, and also younger people should delve into this relationship with confidence and without too much suspicion that they cannot handle. No, actually, each partner in the region has handled their relationship with the United States: the Turks, the Emiratis, the Israelis, the Saudis, the Egyptians as well. So I would say just an attitude of equal partnership. We're here for mutual interests and actually shared values as well. That's very important. And tapping into these shared values, back to this education and some of the values that need to be highlighted. So yeah, just a little bit of oomph and kind of energy into the relationship, I would say.
No, well, thank you. Those are good words of advice from both of you that we will, take into account certainly in the Council's recommendations to both governments. And, we are always envious of how stable the military-to-military cooperation and the defense cooperation has been, and kind of wish sometimes on the civilian side, state and commerce, USTR, you would see that same type of consistency. And that's part of the raison d'etre for the US-Egypt Business Council. Asking for, we know the Iraqi Prime Minister has received an official invitation to visit at the end of July, and we are delighted that that has happened. But we see that, hopefully is the start, and we will certainly recommend that an official visit take place. If the administration wants to follow up on actions, that diplomacy is important and allies are important, and traditional foreign policy is important, then putting words to action with regards to Egypt, the key ally in the Middle East, in the Arab Middle East, would certainly make a difference. So thank you for all of your thoughts, and we may ask you to indulge us in the months ahead and come back to you.
With pleasure.
Thank you both. And thank you, Kathleen. Thank you to all of our members for joining, and we will now adjourn. Kathleen, any final thoughts or anything?
No, thank you all so much for this. It was really informative. Apache appreciates being able to participate. Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye.